When news broke today that the US was planning to officially brand the Houthi militia in Yemen as terrorists, I gotta say, my first reaction was, didn't they already do that?
Are you going to call these a terrorist group, sir?
I think they are.
That was last week. The US had just led a sweeping coalition strike against 60 Houthi targets.
The U.S. and British military have launched strikes against targets in Yemen.
And that was retaliation against a group that for 2 months now has raided and attacked dozens of cargo ships in international waters, undermining one of the most globally important shipping lanes, which effectively links two halves of the world. But here's the funny thing. The Trump administration, years ago, did already put the Houthis on its terrorist list. It was almost immediately after Joe Biden took office, he undid that. So what's going on? And why is this balance, terrorists or not terrorists, actually much more delicate than you might think? The first thing to understand, and what's actually at the heart of all of this, is that when we talk about the Houthis, we're actually talking about two types of terrorist designations. So first, there are what are called specially designated global terrorists. This is a list of groups and people first created under the Bush administration after 9/11, and it is a very long list. If you get on this list, you can't travel to the US, your assets are frozen, interacting with the global financial system becomes much more difficult, and people who help or support you can be punished. But then there's another designation of being a foreign terrorist organization. This is the one most of us are probably more familiar with. The US State Department lists them all online as well. Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And it's this designation that makes it much easier to criminally prosecute anybody the US believes is helping those organizations.
Well, theoretically, you're not supposed to have any contact with a foreign terrorist organization. You would be seen as cooperating with or supporting that organization if you violate the sanctions on the foreign terrorist organization. And this is why the relief agencies are worried.
In 2021, just as Donald Trump was about to leave office, literally the day before Biden was sworn in, his administration branded the Houthis in both of these ways, as specially designated global terrorists and as a foreign terrorist organization. By this point, the US had accused the Houthis of taking control of huge swaths of Yemen by force, attacking US partners in the Gulf, kidnapping, torture, and repression.
At least 22 people are dead, dozens wounded after that explosion at the airport in the Yemeni city of Aden.
But within weeks of taking office, Joe Biden had the State Department reverse course. The Houthis were delisted as terrorists.
The outgoing Trump administration, threw a poison pill at the Biden administration, forcing them to make a decision to take that designation off.
Trump branding the Houthis as terrorists was actually pretty controversial at the time. Even some Republicans were against the idea because Yemen, where the Houthi rebel movement fiercely fought for control, was and is considered one of the worst humanitarian disasters on the planet. A deadly, years-long civil war fueled by competing outside backers like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
About 80% of the Yemeni population, that's over 20 million people, are in need of some kind of humanitarian assistance. And most of them live in Houthi-controlled territories.
The big issue is poverty. The big issue is people don't have income. So the economy has collapsed and people don't have jobs.
The fighting in Yemen has reportedly left more than 160,000 people dead. An estimated 2/3 of the population need aid. And half the population are children. Branding the Houthis, who seized control of a huge swath of the country, including the capital, as terrorists, the fear was, especially from aid groups, that this would risk making an already crippling human catastrophe even worse. Because you can't help terrorists. You can't send them supplies or aid. So how do you help the people under their rule without facing US penalties or criminal liability?
The Biden administration officially lifted the designation of the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen as a global terrorist organization.
Biden campaigned on a promise to make Yemen a priority. Within the first few weeks of his administration, he removed both terrorist labels from the Houthis. And front and center in the government's rationale, a recognition of the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen.
So the Biden administration took it off because they felt that a political settlement was the only solution to the Yemeni conflict. And they felt that the terrorist designation was an impediment to a political solution.
There was a promise to closely monitor Ansar Allah, which is what the Houthis officially call themselves, and there was a continued support of UN sanctions. But the message otherwise was clear. Undermining the Houthis must take a backseat to protecting the flow of desperately needed aid to the millions of people suffering from famine, disease, and displacement. For some time now, there has been pressure on the U.S. to rebrand the Houthis as terrorists. The United Arab Emirates published a white paper in 2022 urging the U.S. to do so, citing direct attacks against civilian targets and U.S. installations in the UAE. And back in November, Republicans sent Biden's Secretary of State a letter demanding the same thing. The Houthi attacks on cargo ships in the Red Sea do seem to have crossed a line for the states. John Kirby of the White House National Security Council speaking to reporters after one of the Houthis' early attacks.
In light of that recent targeting of civilians by the Houthis and now the piracy of a ship in international waters, we have begun a review of potential terrorist designations.
And of course, since then, there have been many more attacks.
And Houthis fired more than 20 drones and missiles right at U.S. and allied warships.
2 commercial vessels were struck there earlier today.
There have now been more than 30 attacks on commercial ships since mid-November.
The militant group vowed to retaliate.
So that brings us to today. The U.S. has announced the terrorist designation on the Houthis will be reinstated, but only the lesser designation, if we can call it that. The Houthis will be listed as specially designated global terrorists effective mid-February, but not as a foreign terrorist organization, which, remember, that's the label that would have given the U.S. a much stronger legal line of attack. And tamping down the designation even further, the U.S. is even promising what it calls unprecedented carve-outs and licenses. We're talking about exemptions here to ensure humanitarian aid into Yemen keeps flowing.
Today's designation targets the Houthis, not the Yemeni people. We are taking a range of steps to ensure that these sanctions preserve the ability of aid organizations to be able to deliver all those much-needed supplies.
This is the balancing act.
I think the Biden administration is in a dilemma. If it doesn't do something, then it looks weak. The big concern is that the people who will be harmed by this designation are, as usual, the ordinary Yemeni population. And there'll be many organizations that don't want to run the risk of falling foul of American legislation and therefore will just stop operating.
But how this move affects the Houthis' ability to carry out its attacks is anyone's guess. Financially, the Houthis, writ large, don't operate in the Western economy in a conventional way. They're backed by Iran, the source of their strength, often smuggled in.
The Houthis will see this as a badge of honor. The smuggling economy related to almost a decade of civil war means that they have their own methods for getting supplies in. The leadership will even see this as enhancing their reputation.
And the fear right now is that this may undercut any attempt to create actual peace, especially in Yemen itself. But this does send a message, and importantly, not only to the Houthis themselves. This is a message to Americans that the Biden administration is taking action, and a message to the world. Pick your allies wisely.